Hey Artnerds, today we're going to paint this watercolor illustration and review Saunders Watercolor. I've tried a number of different cotton rag watercolor papers over the years, from Cheap Joe's Kilimanjaro to Blick Premier to Stonehenge Aqua, and while I have a few favorites, I'm always on the lookout for more affordable cotton rag watercolor papers. While at David's Art Supply in New Orleans, Louisiana a while back, I saw that they were selling Saunders Waterford Classic Watercolor paper. I'd heard a lot of really good things about Saunders Waterford paper, and I've tried the St. Cuthbert's Mill cellulose-based watercolor paper a while back, so I was kind of interested in trying Saunders Waterford here on the channel for you guys. So this is a 20 sheet block of watercolor paper bound on 4 sides. It's white. It's cold pressed with the knot designation, meaning it has a rough texture and a fine grain. It's 100% cotton, mold made, acid-free, and archival, and I bought the 9x12 size as that's something I'm more likely to use. This product was made in England, and as you guys can see, the paper is shrink wrapped. There's a fair bit of information on the other side. Unfortunately, my audio was ruined, and I'm recording this in post with a cold, so I don't actually have that information any longer. I do apologize for that. The little graph at the back lists the 140-pound hot press, the 140-pound cold press, and the 140-pound rough press, with the different sizes and colors that it's available in. And St. Cuthbert's Mill seems to make white and high white papers. I guess high white would be like polar white or ultra white. So generally when I do watercolor illustrations, I like to use cotton rag papers. They tend to be a little bit sturdier than cellulose papers, but when I'm painting comic pages, like for my comic 7-inch Cara, I like to use cellulose papers like Canson Montval. So I do use both types of papers pretty frequently for watercolor illustration. If you guys are interested in checking out my watercolor art and illustration, as well as sneak peeks as to what's coming up on this channel, please add me on Instagram at Instagram.com/natosoup and check out my ArtStation. I'll have both of those linked in the description below, as well as links to where you can buy the things talked about in this video. I'm also going to link my Watercolor Basics playlist and my quick and easy watercolor playlist for those of you who are interested in learning some new watercolor techniques. So finally, after much reading, we get out the X-Acto blade and remove this shrink wrap plastic. Generally, I complain about shrink wrapped art supply products, but since this was being sold open in a store, I have much less of a problem with the shrink wrapping since I didn't also receive a box. Inside, we have a protective first sheet. You can see that it's bound in black on all 4 edges, very similar to Arches, and the print on the inside says, "Situated in the ancient cathedral city of Wells in the southwest England, St. Cuthbert's Mill has been making paper since the 1700s, taking advantage of the pure waters of the River Axe. We are experts in making high-quality artist papers and fine art inkjet papers. We use one of the few cylinder mold machines left in the world, together with natural woolen felt. Our master paper makers produce beautiful papers with stunning texture and excellent surface quality." And then at the top it says, also made by St. Cuthbert's Mill, Bockingford watercolor paper, which I've tried, Milford watercolor paper, Somerset printmaking paper, Somerset enhanced fine art inkjet paper, Somerset photo fine art inkjet paper, and Bockingford inkjet. And then it also says, to release the paper, place a knife under the top sheet in the small unglued area by the cover. Carefully slide the knife around the block, taking care not to damage the surface of the sheet underneath. And you guys can see I successfully removed that protective sheet, leaving our watercolor paper. So for this review, what I want to do is I actually want to remove one of the watercolor sheets from the block. So we're not testing how well this works as a block, we're just testing the paper. Run it through my Canson printer so I can print some blue lines onto it, pencil it, and then watercolor it. So the printer part was not shown, but I do have tutorials on how you can print blue lines onto watercolor paper here on the channel. I'll link those for you guys. I penciled it off camera, and now we're going to do a stretching demonstration. My methods for stretching are not necessarily how do I say this? They're not usually what other watercolor artists do, but they work really, really well for me, and I've been using them for years. So what I use is a cup of clean water, a spray bottle of water, a watercolor mop, some Viva paper towels that don't have much texture to them. That's why I like the Viva paper towels. Blue low-tack painter's tape, preferably the Crepe 3M painter's tape, bulldog clips, binder clips, and a sheet of white corrugated plastic. And I have stretching tutorials here on this channel. This has been time-lapse for everybody's time. In fact, I do want to say the watercolor in this video has been time-lapsed multiple times to get it down into a more watchable format. Watercolor does take time. I spent about 2 days painting this illustration, not including the stretching time. So one of the characteristics I'm looking for in this 140-pound cotton rag watercolor paper is how much it buckles and kips once water has been added. And I stretch it to help prevent that from happening. And I try to stretch my watercolor paper on good, clear, dry days because watercolor paper has a memory. If you stretch it on a humid day and it buckles a lot when you stretch it, every time you saturate the paper, that's going to pop up. So early on, I prepared a wash of ultramarine blue that I'm going to apply as kind of a gradiated toning wash just to kind of help set the mood for this piece. And for those of you who are not familiar, this is Kara from my comic 7-Inch Kara. You guys can read the first 6 chapters for free at 7inchkara.com or 7inchkara.tumblr.com. It is a watercolor comic, so it's really beautiful, lots of really soft, gentle colors, and it's designed to be read for all ages. So if you have a young person in your life who enjoys comics, this could be something that you enjoy reading together. The first thing I do is I apply that gradiated wash of ultramarine to the blue and then wash it out with a little bit of clean water down at the bottom. And it'd been a couple of days since I'd stretched this piece, so I was also looking to see if the paper severely buckled or kipped while I was adding this wash. I also lift it out of Kara's face early on, and that's another property that I'm looking for when I review watercolor papers is liftability and how well I can correct the piece. Once it's had a chance to kind of soak in, I add another wash of ultramarine blue. When that had a chance to dry, I go ahead and I mix up the pink I want for the brick in the background. Now this matches what's used in the comic itself. So it's a mix of alizarin crimson, one of the iridori browns, and one of the iridori oranges. Something else I'm looking for when I'm reviewing the watercolor paper is dry times. I don't want it to dry too quick. That would keep me from being able to blend colors. It would also cause a lot of streaking, but I also don't want it to dry so slow that it feels like it never dries. And one of the things that I like about Saunders is that the dry times are very reasonable. Once the pink has had a chance to dry, I go in with a mix of Hooker's green mixed with a little bit of cool yellow to begin painting the undertones in the grass. I should have mentioned this earlier in the review, but this paper stretched okay and the blue lines washed out okay. Generally, when you use dye-based inks to print your blue lines, you don't really have a lot of problems with them washing out, but some papers are more stubborn, like Stonehenge Aqua loves to hold on to those blue lines and you really have to paint over it. But they washed out of the Saunders watercolor paper quite cleanly. When I added the first wash, it buckled a little. Maybe it was a bit too humid when I stretched it, but it lifts out okay on Kara's face, and I was able to get a diffused gradiated wash. Then I allowed that to dry fully before I started in on the grass. And after it had a chance to dry, it was still sort of warped. So I applied the pink for the bricks, and the Saunders seems rougher, maybe less mushy than some of the other cotton rag papers I've used. So if you're looking for a cotton rag paper that has some backboard to it, this could probably be due to the internal sizing used. Saunders could be a good option for you. This is particularly useful if you want to do dry brush, because instead of the paper getting mushy and just absorbing everything, you're still going to get some of those white speckles on the paper. And I find that this paper is very forgiving for lifting and correcting, and it stays damp, which helps prevent streaking. It is a little bit like painting on cardboard. It's a little crunchy and buckly, and it doesn't dry quite flat. Now, I did allow it to dry overnight a little bit later on in this piece, and that did dry flat. So it's not totally unforgiving. It just holds on to the moisture for a really long time. And for this illustration, I wanted a vignette effect, so I wanted there to be more detail kind of closer to Kara, and then the details fade out as we go into the distance. And for the first night, I really just focused on blocking in major forms. So the bricks, the pipe that Kara's sitting in, and the grass around Kara. This paper is really lovely for wet into wet techniques. Now, sometimes it can be difficult for me to find papers that hold on to moisture long enough to achieve wet into wet, but also dry quick enough to actually be usable. And this is one of the reasons I use cellulose paper for Kara pages, because sometimes I have as many as 9 tiny little illustrations on a single page. So as you guys can imagine, you want to be able to work quickly. Cellulose paper, the water never really soaks in the way it does with cotton rag paper. It kind of evaporates from the surface, and that's why it dries so quickly, but that's why cellulose paper is more prone to streaking. Cotton rag paper, the water soaks in, the pigments soak into the paper, so that's why it stays open for wet into wet techniques like you see with the pipe here longer, but it may take longer to dry. So with the grass, for each layer I mix more Hooker's green into my initial mixture, kind of building up that color saturation. So we started with a light yellow green and we're working progressively darker and more saturated, but I'm also covering less area with each pass, and this helps to develop contrast, and it's also going to help push the vignetting that I want in this piece. I paint grass pretty frequently in 7-inch Cara. It's one of the themes, I guess, this whole viewing the world from a whole new perspective and appreciating things from a completely different angle. So given that Cara is only 7 inches tall, I paint a lot of grass. I've gotten pretty decent at it over the years, and it's still one of my favorite things to paint. There's a few things you're going to want to keep in mind when painting grass to help keep it from becoming mushy and swampy. And that is when you're painting it zoomed out, so like from a normal person point of view, you really want to keep it very light, and you only want to add in darker details here and there rather than all over the whole thing. But when we're zoomed in from Cara's perspective like this, it's really important to develop contrast and to maintain that contrast and to try and capture the individual blades of grass by using strong brushwork. I'm using a mix of brushes here. I have some of the black velvet brushes, which I really like. I also have some Kolinsky sable brushes, and then I have some larger, less expensive squirrel brushes. And each of these brushes kind of serves a specific purpose within my watercolor illustration. I usually use the Kolinsky sable for pulling details and for strong brushwork. And I use the squirrels because they're very soft to do washes or to do glazes because they're less likely to disrupt the pigments underneath. So at this point, I had quit for the night. I allowed it to dry overnight, and I'm coming back to it fresh the next morning. And I noticed that the paper is still board-like. It's still stiff and kind of tough. And this is mostly good. It would hold up to detail well. I've noticed that some of the watercolor papers that I use, they're 140 pound, but they feel thinner, like Arches is one of them. They get very, very mushy. Shizen, hot press, and cold press also get very mushy. This paper has a lot of internal sizing, so it's much less likely to get kind of mushy and soft with you guys. I think of it as like kind of toilet papery, you know what I mean? Where it's just mushy and you can't pull any details and you have to let it dry completely before you can make any progress on it. The Saunders paper is not like that. However, I am having a hard time with details, so I'm going to change my setup for better angles for me personally. When I'm painting, when I'm recording anything, I'm working at this small glass top drawing desk. And of course, recording equipment and drawing equipment take up a lot of space, and it doesn't leave a lot of space for me to work. And as you guys can see, this painting setup takes up a fair amount of space. I have my watercolor propped up a couple of inches, and I've used various implements throughout this video to kind of prop it up. Propping it up allows gravity to help you paint, and it also allows the pigments to sort of just settle on the paper in a way that's more visually interesting than if you were just painting flat. So I try to prop my watercolor paintings up whether I'm painting them myself or not recording, or I'm painting them for you guys. And it did dry fully flat after a while, but it was pretty buckled for a long time. So this paper has a really long open time. So the night prior, I did most of my blocking in. At this stage, other than blocking in stuff on Kara, I'm refining forms, adding more details. So you guys can see that with Kara's skin. I'm using it looks like a silver black velvet brush for her skin right now. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture the amount of contrast I would need to imply that this is a bright, sunny day. So what this means is that I'm going to need bright, strong contrasts. I'm going to need layers that stand up to one another. You can see them, so I need to be more aggressive and saturated with my layers. And I need to be assertive with my light source and where the shadows are coming from. If you're newer to watercolor and you're struggling with contrast, I have a mini series in my Quick and Easy Watercolor. It's my light and contrast series where I show you guys how to paint light and form on various different shapes. And this sort of contrast development is really key to building up the sort of shadows, lighting, and definition that you're going to want in your watercolor piece. So generally when I'm doing watercolor, I'm painting for several hours at a stretch, and I may be working on other projects while I'm waiting for it to dry, or I may be painting other pieces simultaneously. And this is how I'm able to actually paint 7-inch Kara, is I'm usually painting anywhere from a double page spread to 6 pages at a given time. So as I work in batch. So for example, I would paint Kara skin, layer by layer, page by page, and every page would get a layer of skin before I move on to the next thing. So I want to apologize that my hair keeps entering the shot. It is beyond time for a haircut, and I'm leaning in to actually see what I'm doing. So I understand that that's probably pretty distracting, and I apologize for that. I'm going to get a haircut, and that should be far less an issue in the future. Those are my massive bangs cutting into the camera there. So hopefully you guys can tell that I'm trying to develop the piece kind of at the same pace. So I don't really render in details for any specific area early in the piece for a variety of reasons. I like to watch the whole watercolor illustration develop at the same pace rather than like her face is finished and nothing else is done, and that kind of puts me in that ugly stage mode. For a full list of watercolor papers that I've reviewed, as well as links to those reviews, check out my Watercolor Basics page at netosoup.blogspot.com. I also have loads of great written tutorials for people who prefer to work along with writing rather than working along with video or narration. So now that the grass is fairly developed, I'm going to start working on the dandelion leaves, and I want them to add some contrast to the piece, so I'm painting them darker than the grass. And one of my favorite colors for this is Daniel Smith's Undersea Green. It's this really beautiful blue-green color that, depending on what saturation it's mixed in, it's more blue or it's more green, and it sediments out just really, really beautifully. I really enjoy working with this color. On this note, I'm painting with my Daily Driver palette. This is the same palette of colors that I use for 7-inch Cara. And by working with watercolor palettes that I'm very familiar with, I focus less on the paints and more on the paper that I'm reviewing. I've talked about my Daily Driver palette and how I select colors for it in another video, so I will link that for you guys if you're interested in it. But it's kind of a Franken palette. It's a mixture of Winsor Newton, Holbein, Magello, Daniel Smith, Sennelier, maybe a little Kusakabe in there. There's a couple of Soho watercolors in there, and there's a couple of M. Graham watercolors in there. And it's just basically my favorite watercolors from all of the reviews that I've done. And that's why I reviewed so many different watercolor brands a few years ago, is I was trying to find good alternatives to Winsor Newton, which I felt to be kind of expensive for how they performed. And as I enjoyed colors, or as I fell in love with colors, they entered my Daily Driver palette. So at this point, I don't have a lot of notes about the Saunders watercolor paper in my notebook because I just kind of fell into painting, which is a good thing. It means that I kind of got into the groove, I started enjoying it, and I didn't feel like I was fighting with the paper. The Saunders watercolor paper does feel thicker and sturdier than some of the other watercolor papers I've used. Stonehenge Aqua, I love Stonehenge Aqua, but it's a little bit like painting on fabric. It's a softer watercolor paper, and Arches is a thinner watercolor paper. So if you're kind of frustrated with some of maybe the hurdles that painting on Arches might throw up for you, Saunders could be a good alternative, although it is a little bit more difficult to find. I've never seen it at like Plaza or at Michael's, and I was kind of surprised to see it at David's Art Supply. So in addition to Saunders being a little bit more difficult to find, it's also a little bit more pricey. We're painting on the 9x12 block, and it is $65.97 on Amazon, but I want you guys to compare that to the $42.83 for the 10x14 and the $35.66 for the 7x10. It just seems like that particular size might be in a shortage, so it's more expensive. It's $35.30 on Blick. Now compare that to Arches, which is $41.50 on Amazon, still really high, and $29.35 on Blick. So Saunders is going to be a little bit more expensive than some of the other cotton rag watercolor papers on the market. I believe both Arches and Saunders are much more expensive than Stonehenge Aqua, but they're bound on all four sides rather than glue bound on two sides like the Stonehenge Aqua. So at this point, I'm just about finished for the day. I'm kind of adding in final details. At this point, I'm working fat over lean, so I'm using really saturated, thick mixes of paint on top of the really thin glazes that we applied much earlier. At this point, I'm going to allow it to dry overnight and come back to it the next morning. So Saunders watercolor paper has a lot more texture than Fluid 100, and it's not as mushy as the Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press. It kind of reminds me of Canson Heritage Lacrel, a paper with its own opinions, but maybe not as temperamental as the Heritage Lacrel. Its stiff nature might make it a good paper for reworking. So at this point, I'm basically working directly from the half pans with very, very thick mixes. So I'm using very small Kolinsky sable brushes and synthetic brushes. Both of these have fibers that are stiff enough to kind of withstand working with really thick mixes like that and being able to pull really fine details. After a fair amount of finessing and adding details, I'm just about ready to move on to my watercolor pencil stage. Now, I reviewed a bunch of different watercolor pencil brands not too long ago, and I found that I still really love Derwent Inktense watercolor pencils and Caran d'Ache's Supercolor 2 pencils, so that's what I'm going to continue to use. And that's what I'm using here, is the Derwent Inktense watercolor pencils and the Supercolor 2 pencils. And I'm just using them to either add a little bit of extra shading, as in the case with the indigo, or to pop a few extra highlights, as in the case with the yellow. And what I'm also doing is I'm applying it over those little yellow flowers. They tended to get a little too blue-green when I was adding in shadows. And I'm also using some red violet to add some contrast shadows to the dandelion in the background. And I'm using white to pull further highlights. This paper takes watercolor pencil and gouache really well. The stiff nature and the texture on the paper is great for watercolor pencils. So if you're looking for a paper that has enough texture to be fun with your watercolor pencils, the Saunders paper is a great fit. It has almost like a light sandpaper texture, which I feel really lends itself well to using watercolor pencils on top of it. I'm also using a little bit of white gouache just to add some further highlights and to tighten some details back up. And I'm using a small Cuthbert synthetic brush for this just because it happens to be stiff enough and holds a point well enough to work well with using it for gouache highlights. So if you enjoy the work that I do here on this channel, if you find it helpful, useful, and informative, if you like my tutorials, if you enjoy my reviews, or you just enjoy the fact that this channel is not sponsored by outside sources, one of the ways you can help me continue to do what I'm doing is by supporting my work over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. 90% of the materials purchased and reviewed on this channel are purchased out of pocket, and I always disclose when things were sent to me for the purposes of review. This Saunders watercolor pad was purchased by me because I was interested in finding alternatives to arches, and while I really enjoyed using it, it is quite an expensive pad of paper, so your support on Patreon goes towards helping me continue to do watercolor reviews like this one. So I've started to remove the blue painter's tape. I highly recommend when you remove it, you peel it away at a 90-degree angle. So if it tears out of your paper rather than into your paper. And that about wraps it up. I really enjoyed painting this illustration on the Saunders watercolor paper. I do find that for my purposes and the sort of art I make and the sort of prices I charge for my art, the Saunders is a little bit expensive for me. So if you're looking for a paper for illustration and for comic art, I would recommend maybe Fluid 100, Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press, or even Arches if you can find it at a good price point. This is a really sturdy paper. It takes well to wet into wet techniques. It is gelatin sized, and I feel like if you were painting larger pieces, this could be a really good paper for you. I enjoyed having this opportunity to paint for you guys. I hope you found this useful, helpful, and inspiring. And I hope you guys will check out some of the other videos and playlists linked down in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoy my art, please consider checking out 7-Inch Kara. You can actually sign up for information about the Volume 2 Kickstarter that's coming up in the near future by clicking the link down in the description below. Or you can check out more of my art on Instagram at instagram.com/natosoup. Bye guys!